Thank you for the great introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for being here and desiring to listen to me. I think my lecture, I never, beforehand, you try to anticipate what a conference will be like and how it will run and how it will move. I think my lecture will pretty much, connect to the things that we have discussed already, and I will also connect to what you already have described, Gabriella, as the general outline of the conference being a bit messy.
Huh, whatever. Okay.
My lecture is probably also a bit, messy, but I hope it will be thought-provoking. And probably this is the right moment, given Carl's students' enthusiasm about Lacan, to, bring in another voice also. There has to be some critical note to it. So, as an academic, and not an analyst, I now turn to my reading glasses and my paper. This is an act, this is a statement. So my lecture is called Law's Limitation and Lacan's Return to Freud. Can you hear me in the back? Is everything okay? Yeah, okay. So in French intellectual thought of the 1960s and 1970s, there is already developing a critique of Lacan's structural approach. Of these critiques, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus can be considered one of the most important. They pose the question whether desire is intrinsically linked to the Oedipus complex. Their point was not to question the vital importance of parental figures in the child's mental life, nor did Deleuze and Guattari question the importance of the Oedipus complex as such for understanding the dynamics of the neuroses. What they did question, however, were the presuppositions on which the Oedipal desire was constituted, that is, firstly, the notion of loss or lack as related to castration, and secondly, the dialectics of desire and the law of the father. In the background lurked another important issue, namely the problem of the inherent normativity of the Oedipus complex. That is to say, the distinction between a normal and abnormal psychic positions, the first being structured by the law of the father and concerned with not only sexual differentiation, but also with the establishment of a moral profile, you could say. The distinction here basically runs along the lines of the neurotic position or structure versus the perverse and the psychotic positions. And I think the perverse in my lecture is the most interesting. By turning to schizophrenia as the model to understand cultural life, Deleuze and Guattari meant to offer an alternative approach to Lacan's view of the relation between structure and norm. Did Deleuze and Guattari rightfully argue that psychoanalysis lacks a fundamental critique of its own shibboleth, the Oedipus complex? Had psychoanalysis really never developed a non-Oedipal theory or a non-Oedipal outlook? Question mark. Did it simply not cross Freud's and the post-Freudian minds to consider other complexes as nuclear complexes of man's mental life? Or is this issue maybe more complicated than it seems? In this paper, I want to reflect on exactly these questions and other questions, but these questions. I will first give a sketch of Lacan's view on the relation between limitation, loss, and desire. I will argue that Lacan's views on the nature of desire can be seen as a critique of ego psychology's moralism and normativity. I have already addressed this issue. When was it? Last night.
Last night.
This is the problem with a jet lag, that you don't know what time it is. I will argue that the model of Melancholia, I think, serves as the paradigm for the theory on desire and loss. I will then consider the question whether and how the melancholic outline of desire is related to Oedipal thinking. And I will try to show that Lacan remains close to Freud when he points out that the lost object should not be identified as the maternal object. At this point, Lacan, though, distances himself from the object relation theories that make the lost maternal object the shibboleth of their theoretical position. Lacan remains close to Freud in this respect. However, because of the importance of the paternal law and the dialectics of desire, Lacan, I think, is unable to recognize the full radicality of Freud's early, what I would consider, non-Oedipal theory of sexuality. It is in this early theory of sexuality, that probably provides us the material to raise some critical questions in the direction of Lacanian thought. So that is basically the outline of what I want to do. So first, let me start with a section called Against Ego Psychology. That's what you like. So let us take a step back and start with the historical context in which Lacan introduced this famous dictum of the return to Freud. The context of this retour à Freud is well documented. The return is first of all related to Lacan's critique of the strict rules imposed by the International Psychoanalytic Association regarding the training and supervision of psychoanalysts. Many French psychoanalysts protested against the strict rules the international community of psychoanalysts was trying to implement. Together with Lacan, they decided to erect a new independent French society. This is all in the 50s. When an IPA visitation committee headed by Donald Winnicott met with this new French society, the committee proposed that the new society could be recognized by the IPA on the sole condition that Lacan would no longer function as a training analyst. I find it very funny, actually. Visitation committees, I mean, we in academia have constant, we're constantly bothered by visitation committees, so we exactly know what's happening here. As a response to that, this is something that we can learn from Lacan as academics. As a response to that, Lacan established his own École Freudienne de Paris. The École was, of course, a training institute for psychoanalysts, but the most important aspect of this new institution was that it opened the doors for the humanities, something the American associations at that time were not eager to do, and I think with very problematic effects for, let's say, even the current situation of psychoanalysis in the USA, being more or less detached from the academic world. The dispute between the French and the American psychoanalysts was thus first of all about conformity regarding the training and supervision rules. But beyond this, other demands of conformity were at stake. The American psychoanalysts were predominantly ego psychologists, who argued that the aim of psychoanalytic treatment should have to be the strengthening of ego capacities in order for the subject to be able to adapt to societal norms and values. The prime method for this strengthening of the ego was the identification with the analyst, which of course implied that the analyst would also have to be a strong personality himself. And it was for this reason that the training rules were so strict. Lacan's resistance to the IPA concerned the ethics and anthropology implied and applied by ego psychology. It was in this context that Lacan called for the return to Freud. That is to say, not so much the late Freud, to whom Heinz Hartmann and other ego psychologists could more easily relate, but the somewhat more earlier Freud, who had developed a theory of narcissism, showing that the ego is something constructed, something constituted in the course of time, something inherently conflictuous, because of the fact that the ego will never coincide with its ideal, and something both familiar and strange because of the idea that the subject will only recognize itself in the image of oneself that is also an image of another, recognized by others. In other words, we cannot think of the ego in terms of unity or strength or harmonization, since we cannot think of the ego without notions of alienation and conflict. And what about adaptation and conformity? Well, these are the fantasies of the obsessional neurotic, who thinks he can live up to his ego ideal when simply sticking to the self-imposed rules that do not conflict with the broader societal rules. No, Lacan does not accept obsessional neurosis with its fixations and petty rules and formalities to become the model for both psychoanalysts and the analysand. And probably here we find an important reason for Lacan to disconnect the Freudian association of oidipal structures and obsessional neurosis. In search of his own position, Lacan, while more or less emancipating himself from Melanie Klein, Lacan was in his early career basically a Kleinian, but in search of his own position, he will first of all return to Freud's theory on narcissism and the notion of identification with an image, and what he will call the mirror stage, in order to experience oneself as a subject that is as oneself through alienation of oneself. Narcissism is about identification, and as we all know, it is narcissistic identification that in Freud's work paved the way for the further articulation of the identification with objects, notably the father and later father figures and authorities. In fact, the narcissistic ego ideal is already molded according to a certain imaginary perception of the almighty and perfect father. It is this father, more precisely in Lacanian terms, the law of the father, le nom du père, that sets limits to both the child's narcissistic fantasies, in particular the fantasy of being the mother's exclusive love object, and the mother's fantasy reducing the child to her phallus, allowing her to overcome her lack. The father's prohibition sets limits to both the child's and the mother's imaginary fantasies and introduces the child into the symbolic order, the cultural realm in which the child has a name and attached to the name a particular identity in which the child can find a certain pleasure, the pleasure of being a particular person with particular desires. For indeed, the child is now learns to articulate its own desires. I mean, that's the whole point of being in a symbolic order, I would say. And hence, it learns to find pleasure in specific desirable objects instead of clinging to the illusory enjoyment of being one's own ego ideal and having access to the full satisfaction of all needs and desires, while being devoured by the mother's desire for the child. The father's prohibition thus sets limits, and in doing so, in a certain sense, liberates the child from its own and the mother's all-compassing, devouring desire. At this point, you can clearly see the influence of Klein. At this point, however, Lacan will also stress that the fact that the father's law by no means implies the subject's adaptation or conformity to societal norms and values. Surely the subject cannot escape his cultural environment, and Lacan will stress the fact that the symbolic order precedes the subject, and that the unconscious should not be regarded as the private subconscious realm of wishes, needs, and desires, but that the unconscious is actually out there in the symbolic structure of culture itself, and that the symbolic order is the real subjectum, the ground bearing man's identity. And here we can clearly see Lacan's structuralist approach to subjectivity, in which he implicitly distances himself from Freud's biologistic approaches. But the fact that the symbolic order precedes the subject does not imply that man's introduction in the symbolic order equals adaptation to symbolic order. That's an important point, of course, if you want to struggle with ego psychology. If this were the case, the individuation process would equal the process of adaptation to shared norms and values, and the acceptance of a certain role in the societal fabric. If that were the case, Lacan would not be able to present an alternative to the ego psychologist's moralism. He would then in fact defend a kind of scholastic doctrine in which the desire of the individual for the good is always realized within the given social and symbolic framework. Lacan will argue to the contrary. Just as there is a tendency to find pleasure within the boundaries of the symbolic order, there is a recalcitrant or a resistant, subversive tendency not to adapt, but to resist. A tendency that does not regard the law as demarcating the realm of possibilities of pleasure and personhood, but a tendency, a desire, produced by the law itself, aimed at exactly what is excluded from the symbolic order, from the endless chain of signifiers, namely the real thing, the ultimate signifier, the ultimate object of which all other objects are merely representations and substitutions. Lacan actually refers to this thing as the thing, la chose, soon to call it, later, in this somewhat later word, the objet petit a, the ultimate object of desire, the orientation point around which representations and desire, regulated by the pleasure principle, are organized. The non-symbolized and unimaginable object that is there like a black hole in the center of the universe, attracting all matter without releasing it. It is the ultimate point of mental gravitation. This thing, la chose, is the forbidden good, Lacan writes, gaining its importance and weight from the very fact that it cannot be symbolized and that it is prohibited by the law. According to Lacan, the desire of this thing is a melancholic desire, always aimed at refining something regarded as the good par excellence, the sovereign good, which provides enjoyment, jouissance. The mother as the object of incestuous desire and as prehistoric other may represent this good. Exactly this incestuous object of desire gives us a clear indication of the cause of desire and of why Lacan names this cause the foundation of the moral law. This object is the forbidden object of desire, a prohibition introduced by the father. Desire is thus always in Lacan a reaction to a limitation. It is caused by the law of the father. It is thus the very law that introduces the subject into the symbolic order that incites the very desire that undermines it, subverts and transgresses the symbolic order. Again, and this is crucial, Lacan stresses the conflictuous tendencies in the subject, tendency towards conformity to societal norms on the one hand, because that's also an aspect of mental life, and transgression and subversion on the other hand. Obedience and recalcitrance go hand in hand as the two sides of the same coin named duty. This, let's say, short sketch of Lacan's ideas, it's a very rough, short sketch of Lacan's ideas on the symbolic order and desire, serves a simple purpose. I want to underscore some of the fundamental issues in Lacan you are probably already familiar with. Limitation through the law of the father, lack as the cause of desire, and the melancholic nature of desire as it is always aimed at an object supposed to be lost, supposed to be exiled by the very law itself. Finding the object, Lacan says with Freud, finding the object is also always refining the object. Objectfindung, says Freud in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, Objectfindung is always Wiederfindung. Every object is always merely a substitution of the primal, real, and ultimate lost object. Let us keep this in mind let us keep in mind this reference to Freud's 3 essays, because I will return to it later. Let me first make some comments on the melancholic nature of desire. The notion that every Objektfindung is essentially Wiederfindung. In her book on depression and melancholia entitled Black Sun, Julia Kristeva once argued that in psychoanalysis, melancholia is not merely limited to a specific form of identity or a pathological formation distinct from other identities or formations. Psychoanalysis instead shows itself to be grounded in modernity and the problems and questions modernity articulates and addresses, exactly at the point where the whole Freudian and post-Freudian theory, and I quote, detects everywhere the same impossible mourning for the maternal object, unquote, as the ultimate and lost object of desire. Rather than a specific pathological formation, melancholy, says Kristeva, is a discourse rooted in the basic structures of modernity. Julia Kristeva is not the only one who recognized this. Michel de Certeau started his book, The Mystic Fable, published in the 1980s, with a few sentences in which he expresses that the study of modern mysticism and the mystic's discourse on the desired presence of the absent God indeed emerges from, I quote, a mourning, an unaccepted mourning that has become the malady of bereavement, perhaps akin at the ailment melancholia, which was already a hidden force in 16th century thought, unquote. Indeed, it is from the 16th century onwards, largely under the influence of Reformation, that thought that melancholia becomes to describe the awareness of and response to loss of a loved object. Kristeva and de Certeau articulate something important when they both regard the psychoanalytic discourse on melancholy part of the hidden force in modernity itself, the sense of loss that haunts the modern intellectual life and modern religion. Not only these thinkers, but also the 20th century phenomenology of religion. This is a little bit of a way astray. But also the modern intellectual life. But not only these thinkers, but also 20th century phenomenology of religion, from Lévi-Brühl to Charles Taylor, I think, reminds us of the fact that modernity starts with loss. Loss of the self-evidence of faith and religion, loss of participation in a divine reality, loss of an ontological and teleological framework in which everything has its fixed place, meaning, and orientation. Lacan recalls this in his seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, when he points at the profound anti-Aristotelian outline of Freudian thought, man's propensity towards evil, and the fact that love is not simply the outcome of the unfolding of potentials, but instead should always be regarded as entangled with hate, and probably the hate is the more fundamental passion. Something is at the heart of man's desire, Lacan writes, but this thing is not the sovereign good as conceptualized in Aristotelian thought. The ultimate object of desire is instead the prohibited object, the object excluded from the symbolic and hence also gaining its weight through the law of the thought. Lacan, like de Certeau and Kristeva after him, already recognized that psychoanalytic thought was firmly rooted in the problems that haunt modernity from the moment the madman from Wittenberg, this is the nickname that Lacan gives to Luther, the madman from Wittenberg started to question all apparent self-evident worldviews. What if the world is not representing a divine order? What if Adam's fall describes loss of love, founded in an even more original hatred? What if the true imitation of Christ implies being able to say, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Should we not think of faith and theology as grounded in this paradoxical experience of being so intimately close and infinitely estranged from God at the same time. Simul justus et peccator, man as simultaneously estranged and related, lost and saved, abandoned and intimately related. Is this paradox not in a sense at the heart of the Freudian melancholic position? That is to say, the melancholic's awareness of loss of the love object, and at the same time clinging to the most intimate of all relationships, namely the one established through identification. So let me further reflect on melancholy, loss, and wiederfindung. So the following question needs to be asked, I think. Is indeed psychoanalysis in the end all about loss, desire for what is lost? Is negativity the true shibboleth of psychoanalysis? And can the lost object be identified as the maternal object? Let us start with what only appears to be an affirmation of these questions. It is a fact that Freud's dictum of that the Oedipus complex is the shibboleth of psychoanalytic theory has had a huge impact on post-Freudian psychoanalysis. We only need to look at the variety of object-relation theories, of which Lacan's own theory is an exponent amongst others, in order to recognize that in post-Freudian theories the object complex, Oedipus complex, remains cherished as the shibboleth. The discourse on the nuclear family is everywhere: the father, the mother, the son, and sometimes the daughter. And yes, in these primal object relations, there is inevitably the awareness of loss. We can think of Donald Winnicott's theory of the transitional sphere as the playground for the experience of absence and presence, loss and intimacy regained. The child's play, its intellectual activity, creativeness, fantasies, and wit are all involved in the one huge task the child faces, dealing with the inevitable loss of the symbiotic unity with the mother, and learning to live in a reality in which there is no big other that comforts, protects, and loves. More recently, Donald Capps, a strong advocate of Erik Erikson's thought, but also drawing upon Melanie Klein's ideas on the depressive position, introduced the concept of the melancholic self, indicating man's lifelong desire for the maternal object, the all-compassing love of the mother. These are only two examples of what appears to be a common sense, to be common sense among many psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic theorists, the psychological weight of the loss of the maternal object. In a certain reading of Lacan in secondary literature, we find a similar train of thought. The lost ultimate object of desire, la chose itself, is no other than the mother herself. I'm not saying that all Lacanians say, but there is a certain reading of Lacan which this appears. However, this is not what Lacan is saying. For Lacan, the mother is not the primal ultimate object. In fact, the mother functions within imaginary and symbolic parameters. She is the first in a chain of objects that represents la chose, but she is not the thing itself. Lacan is very explicit about this, and it is important because if the mother were the ultimate object of desire, we would sooner or later inevitably be confronted with a strong implicit normativity of the Oedipus complex, namely the norm of heterosexuality and procreation. Lacan can draw upon Freud's theory of melancholia here. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud, from 1915, Freud presents a basically non-Oedipal theory of melancholia. That is to say, he does not relate the melancholic's awareness of loss to the loss of a maternal object as such. According to Freud, mourning is the proper and normal reaction to the loss of a beloved person. In Melancholia, however, Freud argues it is not clear what exactly has been lost. Something, but not necessarily someone, has been lost. The actual loss of a person can be the accidental occasion that triggers melancholia, but other constitutional causes are far more important, says Freud. And this is because melancholia is not concerned with the loss of an actual object, a person as such, but with a quality incorporated by that object, or by an object. Since the lost object is in fact a quality ascribed to an object, the actual object need not even be lost in order for the melancholic to experience loss. The loss here concerns primarily the love of, and the love for the object. And this is the reason why Freud does not focus on accidental causes, but on constitutional ones, notably the ambivalence of feelings of love and hate that characterize all human attachments to objects, and on narcissism, more specifically the fact that the object choice was narcissistic in the first place, meaning that a person chooses an object as love object because of its quality to love or even adore the person. In other words, the person loves himself or herself through the love of the other. And it is precisely because of this narcissistic dynamics that the melancholic is not prepared to give up the attachment to the lost object. Narcissism is thus the key to understand melancholic desire. In no way does the status of the lost object depend on its relation to the mother. The lost object is, via narcissism, ultimately related to autoerotism. And this brings me to Freud's theory on sexuality. Is psychoanalysis all about loss and desire for what has been lost? Is all Objektfindung always Wiederfindung of something lost? And what is the nature of this something lost? At this point, it is important to have a look at Freud's three essays on the theory of sexuality. And I mean the version of 1905, not the later officially approved version of 1924, that you are probably more acquainted with. Why this text? The reason is quite obvious when you read that first version of the three essays. Freud develops very clearly a non-Oedipal theory of sexuality, based on his studies on hysteria and directed against the profoundly normative approach of sexuality he detected in the contemporary psychiatric and sexuological literature. Let me briefly sketch the outline here. We can start with a Foucauldian point, I think. The 19th century science is not only obsessed with the description of sexuality and its so-called perverse deviations, it also produces sexuality and its deviations not only as concepts, but as phenomena and as identities. After a period of the development of theories differentiating between normal and abnormal sexuality from an anatomical perspective, post-Darwinian psychiatry developed another approach. Sexuality became defined in terms of its reproductive function. That is to say, the normal object choice is heterosexual and the normal aim is procreation. This normal sexuality is regulated by what Richard from Krafft-Ebing, and he's the most, let's say, most predominant scholar in this psychiatric literature. Krafft-Ebing and others call the Geschlechtstrieb, the sexual instinct, which is basically the reproduction instinct, just as we find in animal and vegetative life forms. All aberrations from this functional definitions are now identified as perversions, or actually it is only now possible to identify the perversions as perversions. And Krafft-Ebing famously categorizes the non-functional abnormal forms of sexuality: exhibition and voyeurism, sadism and masochism, homosexuality, fetishism. These perversions do not describe occasional perverse acts. That would be let's say, your dirty man who is leading a normal life with a wife and children, but once a year goes to the whores, prostitutes. That's an occasional perverse act, which he calls perversiteit. But actually, the perversions is something else. It refers to a specific identity, different from normal sexual identity formations. The homosexual, the exhibitionist, the sadist, the masochist, etc. Whereas Kraft-Ebing cum suis took their starting point in normal functional sexuality regulated by a natural instinct, Freud's approach is exactly the opposite. He will claim that in order to understand the building blocks of sexuality, we first have to investigate the perversions. Why? Because clinical evidence suggests that there is no such thing as a natural object or aim of the sexual impulses. What the actual perversions show in an intensified and magnified way through fixation are the components of sexuality we find in every human being. Based on his insights in the central problematic of hysteria, such as bisexuality, the disgust and fear of excrements, and the importance of pain and pleasure linked to bodily zones, Freud provides us with a complete new perspective on both sexuality and the instincts. The instinct is no longer a natural instinct in the service of reproduction or even self-preservation. Freud defines the instinct as an organic impulse that through contact with erogenous zones becomes sexual. This is his first definition of the instinct drive in 1905. It is not based on any form of negativity. It does not proceed from a lack or loss. It is merely an impulse that through contact with erogenous zones becomes sexual. Now, what does Freud mean by sexual? The excitation of bodily zones, such as the skin or the mucous membranes, determines the sexual character of the drive. The question now pops up what Freud means by sexual when it is defined relative to the excitation of zones and organs. Starting point and model for this discussion of these manifestations is the phenomenon of Ludel, thumb sucking, a rhythmic oral activity that he describes as a sexual activity. It is sexual because, according to Freud, it provides autoerotic pleasure and is non-functional. He argues that the child discovers this pleasure incidentally and not intentionally, while sucking the mother's breast or sucking a milk bottle. What exactly does the child discover? It does not discover the pleasure of satisfaction through nourishment as such, but it discovers that the rhythmic sucking and the warm flow of milk is pleasurable. The sexual excitement is nothing but a physical, pleasurable activity originating from the instinct and the excitability of erogenous zones. The attachment to the object providing the milk is not essential to sexuality. Breasts or milk bottles are only instrumental in the discovery of autoerotic pleasure. The paradigm for infantile sexuality, Freud writes, is the lips kissing themselves. I find that's a very strong image for autoerotic pleasure. The lips kissing themselves. I think we would all like that. It will only first be in puberty that the genital zone and the breast sucking will get a paradigmatic meaning in sexual life, because it is only in puberty that sexuality is fundamentally reorganized and gets directed at objects. Sexual pleasure only now becomes intimately associated with Objektfindung. And it is in this context that Freud will say that Objektfindung is Wiederfindung. But this Wiederfindung does not refer to refinding an original object of sexuality, because there was no original object of sexuality. Moreover, infantile sexuality is radically without an object. The refinding concerns the autoerotic pleasure and the erogenous zones, now reinvested from the perspective of adult object-related sexuality. So it's all about refinding let's say, a regime of autoerotic pleasure, but now through object relations and fantasies. You see, Freud's depiction of infantile sexuality has nothing to do with Oedipal structures. Even more important, and very radical in fact, infantile sexuality is not object-related and non-intersubjective. And as a consequence, instinct and desire can neither be defined as originating from loss of a maternal object, nor are they originally related to a paternal law. What is experienced in puberty as lost is not a maternal object, but a certain regime of autoerotic pleasure. And the instinct is merely an impulse that is looking for release of tension. Moreover, it is not grounded in negativity. It is not grounded in lack, and certainly not in a prohibiting law. Hence, it is exactly here, in our return to Freud's first edition of the three essays, that we find a radical, non-Oedipal, non-intersubjective theory of sexuality, in which there is no place for a dialectics of loss, law, and desire. So from here I can proceed to my final remarks and some questions. I think there are two important ideas expressed in Freud's 1905 edition of the three essays that are unfortunately not always recognized. One reason for the misrecognition of this edition was that it was never translated in English, which is a remarkable fact. What we have in the standard edition is the officially approved version of 1924, in which the Oedipus complex still plays no big part, but in which Freud has at least introduced some perspectives that nuance or even oppose his earlier theory. There's a strong developmental approach now, and inherently linked to this, a more normative approach of the normal development of sexuality towards the mature sexuality in the service of procreation. Also, the finding of the object is situated much earlier now, suggesting that especially the mother has a more prominent place in infantile sexuality than Freud originally thought. And so, since we normally read the later edition, much of the early radical ideas escape our attention. That is, if we read Freud, for this is not self-evident, at least not among academic scholars in psychoanalysis, who tend to focus on Lacan instead, praising him for the fact that it was a French stroke of genius to relate psychoanalysis to the humanities and the arts. Why should we then read Freud if we have Lacan as his main interpreter for an academic public? Question mark. And yet it is precisely a return to Freud, a rereading of the three essays to be more precise, that allows us to raise some important questions. The first one we have already discussed, but let me briefly repeat it again. We can see that Lacan's interpretation of the Oedipus complex relative to the nature of desire, certainly in his seminars from the 50s and early 60s, is an attempt to provide an alternative for the moralist adaptation models of ego psychology and for the fixation on the maternal object in other object relation theories. We also know that Lacan in his later writings provided a critique and reformulation of the Freudian Oedipus complex. But the question is and remains whether Deleuze and Guattari are not actually right, or have at least a good point, when they argue that psychoanalysis, including Lacanian psychoanalysis, never fully developed non-Oedipal theory. After all, despite the critique of the Oedipus complex in Lacan's later writings, the paternal law and the master signifier are the clear indications of Oedipal thought. The fact that Deleuze and Guattari turned to schizophrenia instead already points in an important direction. Was not Freud's Oedipus complex solely based on his insights in obsessional neurosis? The 1905 free essay shows clearly that Freud developed a non-Oedipal theory of sexuality based on clinical insights in hysteria and the perversions, and not obsessional neurosis. In addition, he provides us with a theory of the instincts that is not grounded in negativity. It is interesting and important to explore these issues further, not the least because a definition of sexuality in terms of pleasure might be more interesting and productive than a theory of sexuality that evolves around sexual differentiation and normal sexual relationships. At this point, I could conclude that we need a more Foucauldian reading of Freud, maybe more than a Lacanian reading. That is to say, a reading of Freud that conceptualizes the instinct in relation to what Foucault would call le corps de plaisir, the body of pleasure or the excitable body. The body of pleasures, the excitable body, as our most fundamental position and last stance of cynical protest against the parental force of discipline. In such a reading, the body is seen as creating meaning, and I mean the body now, the biological body. And this is something different than what Lacan seems to be saying when focusing on language and culture as providing meaning ex nihilo, hence without being dependent on the body of nature, on the body, the biological body, or depending on nature, but projecting meaning and loss on the body, the object A as the opening up of the body, and the whole idea of the erogenous body. So that's one point. The other major interesting issue Freud addresses in the three essays is the issue of the perversions, as showing us the building blocks of human sexuality. We know that Freud develops this point through the idea of the polymorphous, perverse nature of the instincts. How are these instincts further shaped and limited? Well, first of all, the limitation proceeds from an inner organic limitation that Freud calls the reaction formation, shame and disgust, thus giving a certain meaning or a certain form to certain forms of sexual activities without the language function. Further then, of course, the limitation is confirmed and strengthened through societal conventions, is the point where language comes in. Intersubjectivity and language further shape and organize the already organically formed first psychic structures and limitations. Lacan's approach of the perversions seems to be very different, and at this point I would like to mention the work of Tim Dean from the University of Buffalo, who has written some excellent articles on the problematic status of the perversions in Lacanian thought. Lacan identifies perversion as a structure to be distinguished from a neurotic or psychotic structure. The reason is related to the different functioning of the law in these structures. Of course, we are now speaking of the paternal, which is the cultural law. And this has two effects. The first effect is that perversions can now be associated with a specific identity, a certain form of personhood different from other forms. Much of what Freud said about the polymorphous perverse nature of the instincts has now suddenly disappeared under the carpet. Perversions become primarily associated with a specific abnormal identity again. The second effect is that perversions are again, like in the writings of Freud's predecessors, associated with moral transgression of the law. The pervert is the person who willingly and knowingly transgresses the law. The Lacanian pervert, in the end, I think, is the Kantian subject inclined to radical evil, knowingly and willingly transgressing the moral laws and the imperatives of the social fabric. And so, you see, we move from the clinical material into the realm of morality and even juridical standpoints. I'm not saying that Lacan or Lacanians are in the end moralists as regards to perversions, but what I am saying that in a sense, Lacan not only returns to Freud, but at this point, the point of the perversions, also returns to the logics of Freud's predecessors in psychiatry and sexuology. And this might help us to understand why some Lacanians make such close associations between perversion and moral transgression, and why some Lacanians in the end end up defending the so-called normal neurotic position, which makes them indeed not only inclined to defend a certain conservative positions as regard family politics, but in effect even turns them into kind of moralists, Lacan criticized in ego psychology. The fact that in recent debates, I am from Europe, so I have to refer to my European context here. The fact that in recent debates in France on gay marriage and the adoption of children by gay people, some Lacanian psychoanalysts suddenly allied with conservative Catholics defending good old family values is telling in this respect. Now, I will and cannot go into further detail here, but it seems clear to me that Freud's theory on sexuality is still a challenge for psychoanalytic theory and for Lacanian psychoanalysis. A challenge that cannot and should not be easily smothered by Oedipal reasoning. Notably, it is a challenge for Lacanian psychoanalysts in view of Freud's ideas on the polymorphous perverse nature of sexuality and its inner limitations, and related to this, the idea of the organical dynamics of sexuality as providing meaning without reference to negativity or without reference to language. I hope my point and my intention is clear. The return to Freud, any return to Freud, confronts us with puzzling questions, radical ideas, and disturbing notions that should be discussed in order to advance psychoanalytic thought beyond the inevitable Oedipal references to the maternal object or the parental law. Such a return to Freud will truly make psychoanalysis interesting. Thank you.
All right, questions?
Thanks for an excellent talk. That was really interesting since, as you say, is that English, is that essay now translated into English or it's still not in English?
We're working on it.
You're working on it. Oh,
We're working on it. It's going to be...
I had a question. So, well, I guess first I should say I'm very sympathetic to the view. I agree. I just want to press you a little bit to clarify the consequences of your thesis, or maybe to clarify just a little bit of where we would go from here. If I take the very last line of your presentation, it has me a little confused. If we take the Lacanian return to Freud and then we return not to the edible Freud but to the non-edible Freud, right? I'm sort of, so one, I guess a couple consequences could follow, and I just want to see which ones you think we should follow up on. One would be just abandon Lacanianism. Sorry, Lacanians. But like that could be one consequence at this point, is that tradition is so absolutely entrenched in lack and negativity that you cannot pull it out because it is founded on a certain edible return to Freud, which is just irrecoverable. Another consequence that could follow from this is losing what we were basically right. Schizoanalysis is the way to go, not psychoanalysis, and they've already done this, or we should continue in their tradition of Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari and just not take up the Lacanian return to Freud, but take up the whatever you want to say, post-structuralist or Foucauldian Deleuzian return to a kind of schizoanalytic practice, which has nothing really to do directly with Lacanianism. Anyway, those are two potential directions, but I'm just wondering what you think this would actually look like, what the impacts, if we took what your point is seriously, what consequences should follow from that.
Okay, thank you for your question. Excellent question. Should we abandon Lacan in summa? No, we shouldn't. I think. I mean, there's many interesting points in Lacan. I simply want to, let's say, question what you might almost call the universal or the universality of something like a parental law or a maternal object. I mean, maternal object now in other theories as well. And certainly, I mean, the whole return to Freud by Lacan, I sketched the context, is by and large very plausible and a very important one, focusing on, let's say, the whole paradoxical, conflictuous, let's say, construction of the human condition or subjective, whatever you want to call it. So in that respect, Lacan is, I think, a very important voice. But I think we should, at least nuance the importance of, let's say, the orbital structures that are present in the meaning.
So we keep Lacan, but we don't accept Lacan. I'm sorry, my mind just kind of broke right there.
We don't accept Lacan as the sole.
Lacan and symbolic.
We don't accept Lacan as the only way to approach subjectivity. That would be my point, and it would connect to what I would answer to the second question. Because what is really interesting about Guattari and Deleuze pushing forward schizophrenia as a model to interpret society, which is basically what is that they do something that Freud already did in his early work, which I would call, let's say, a pathoanalysis of existence, or pathoanalysis of the human condition. That is, to use the various psychoneurotic models as models to describe, let's say, fundamental complexes of subjectivity or of the human being. So what does hysteria show us? Well, hysteria shows us the building blocks of sexuality. What does obsession neurosis show us? Well, it shows us the whole complex that is related to the Oedipus complex. It shows us the ambivalence of love and hate. It shows us the importance of the parental figures. It shows us the importance of identification, sense of guilt. That's also part of our, but it's not everything. The same thing for melancholia. It shows us some constitutional aspects of the human being. Again, the ambivalence of love and hate, but here also the problem of identification and loss, a certain sense of guilt that is related to death, etc. So you have different complexes describing, let's say, the different complexes that constitute human beings. Now, the problem is always to make one of these complexes the nuclear complex. This is, of course, what Freud did. Alas, in Totem and Taboo, he says we take obsession neurosis in the Oedipus complex as the nuclear complex of all psychoneuroses. And in a sense, he destructed his own project. And I think that this is why Lacan, Deleuze and Guattari are important to say that you can use another model to, map out certain structures. And so my thesis would be here, why not return to that original Freudian idea of having these various psychoneurotic models that you might use to describe, understand, or analyze certain complexes without making them the nuclear complex of everything. So that would be, and in that sense, we would not lose Lacan's thought on the loss or the law of the father. But we would say, okay, but this is maybe a structure that we can identify here, here, and here, but maybe somewhere else, something else is at work. Like the hysteria as a model using to describe infantile sexuality. So that would be my answer to your question.
I think it was answered really in your last bit of that response there. My concern, of course, was that if you followed along the Lacanian trajectory, with the knowledge of the Deleuzian and Guattarian kind of criticism, the arbitrarity of choosing the neurotic, or even the schizoid as the kind of centric nuclear model, what does it look like for Lacan? Because in the way that I was mapping out some of the discussion, it seems that the narcissist becomes that kind of centric nuclear center, around which psychoanalysis would build an entire framework. Is that not what Lacan's saying? We need to divest into multiple different subjects as kind of the origin points or the nucleus, I guess?
Well, narcissism is such an important aspect in both Freudian and Lacanian thought. Not because it is tied to a specific psychoneurosis, but it is tied to, let's say, the development of every individual. So here we have something that seems that you, it might, yeah, well, no, you cannot, it is of a different order than the psychoneuroses, because in itself, it's not a pathological structure. It's something, it's a very normal constituting stage, as Freud would call it, or moment, let's say, in Lacan. So it's of a different order. It's an important point because, of course, you could, if you wouldn't know this, you might think that narcissism is linked to narcissistic disorders, but narcissism has nothing to do with disorder. It's a normal constitutive, as I said, stage or moment in the development of an identity.
Well, I think I wasn't wrong when I said that we analysts had a need for philosophers to keep us working and thinking and rethinking. But again, my feeling, and I think it's something that has been said in these mini conferences, is that perhaps we're moving too quickly, I should say. In Lacan, I think, morality and perversion lie on the same side. That is why he wrote Kant avec Sade. There is nothing more perverse, or I should rephrase it. Perversion is best shown moral than anywhere else. I should also say that I think at least the first French to talk about going beyond the Oedipus complex was Jacques Lacan. Even before Deleuze, perhaps the French has this ugly habitude of avoiding quotations. But it's true that if you want to go beyond the Oedipus complex, Lacan can be really a platform. I would like also to add that autoerotism, as far as you can hear it in the clinics, is something that is absolutely disruptive. It's what takes us, it should be like something as a heterotism. I think that what hysteria shows in the fantasies of abuse is, and this is in Freud, you can find it, the fantasies of seduction are in place of the memory of autoerotism. This is totally Freudian. What I mean by this, what is disruptive in the scene of abuse is not the jouissance of the other, of the abuser, is this jouissance awakened in the body of, we could say, the child. But the fantasy of seduction is actual in that sense. It occurs when it happens. not in the sense of an old past, but a very actual transference, I would say. So I wouldn't run so fast in the sense of opposing perversion to moral, and also in the sense that I think what Melancholia offers is that there is no loss there. The melancholic cannot lose, and that is why he or she is driven, or I would say, fixated to a loss that is not actually happening. In that sense, I don't think that loss and melancholia lie on the same side.
Mm-hmm.
Because melancholia retains the loss, withholds the loss. By, as you said, not knowing what is lost within what is lost. And I wanted to know your opinion on that.
Yeah. No, thank you for your intervention, and these are good remarks. I should have taken a note on this. I try to recall what the first thing is. What you said.
Can't accept. Can't accept.
No, you're right. I wasn't. My whole point was to say that you can only understand perversion in relation to the law. That is what the whole section about Kant and Sartre is about.
Yeah, but
and that you need a law to be perfect, because you have to transgress the law. But this is an other conception of perversion than, let's say, the whole thinking of Freud about the amorphous perverse nature of the drive, which needs no law. In Lacan, the perversion is always relative to law. So this is an important distinction. I think also what you said about hysteria, of course I recognize, let's say, the Lacanian interpretation of the Freudian hysteria. But again, the question here is, if you talk about hysteria, the Freudian hysteria in terms of jouissance, in the background is again the law. You can only speak in Lacanian thought about jouissance, again in relation to law. What I try to argue is that in Freud's theory of hysteria, there is no law. So you have a problem here in Lacan's return to Freud. You end up with a different reading. Lacanian reading of hysteria is another one, the Freudian one. And Freud's idea on the perversions, the polymorphous perverse nature of the drive, is something else than Lacan's idea on the perversions relative to law. That's the main point I want to make. So, in making that point, I want to show where the problems and the questions lie. Let's say, in the return to Freud, including the Lacanian return. You end up with fundamental issues that you need to discuss. And these, in both cases, hysteria and perversion, concern the status of the law. And this answers your remark on the Oedipus complex. Because it's true, of course, that Lacan, before Guattari and Deleuze, already criticized the Oedipus complex, the Freudian version of it. But given the predominancy of the law, parental law, in Lacan's thought, or the later ideas of the master signifying, etc., the question is whether he really can think beyond, let's say, a reference to an Oedipus complex or an Oedipus structure. At the moment he talks about parental law, there is a reference to the Oedipus. can you think of Lacan developing a non-Oedipal theory? No, I don't think so. It's a question, but I don't think so. I don't believe that, even if he criticizes. That's why the critique of Deleuze and Guattari probably comes after Lacan's first criticism of the Oedipus complex, because they see that Lacan cannot really get rid of the Oedipal structures. It's deep in his conceptual freedom. So that's my response to your question. It all comes down, of course, to how we read Freud. That's my bottom line.
Yeah. I don't know again.
But I mean, isn't it playing fast, a little bit faster than loose? But I mean, isn't the Foucault Deleuze-Guattari line really more that instead of returning to Freud, right, what Lacan should have done is return to Saussure. Now, not explicitly an anti-Oedipus, but as Deleuze goes on and gets more in some of his own way structuralist. I mean, the point is that, I mean, the controversy really is whether sexuality and the Oedipal discourse, the fact of that produces certain kinds of discourse, or whether the Freudian discourse itself is a product of linguistic structures, in a way. And so, I mean, playing fast and loose, I would say that Deleuze, as he moves on past to 1,000 Plateaus and other works, is really saying what Lacan shouldn't have returned to Freud. He should have returned to Saussure.
Yeah.
Were his.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I think you're right. And that's also why I smuggled in a little bit of Foucault.
Yep.
Because I think that is an interesting path to explore that train of, let's say, the early Freud on infantile sexuality towards the conceptualization of, let's say, the body, but in this term, the biological body,
And
as the body of pleasure.
And there is a wing of French psychoanalysis which started with Lacan and then split on this point with Pontalis and Laplanche.
Yeah.
Which sort of almost heated the idea of, well, maybe we need to return more to Saussure than to Freud, which would then recontextualize Freud and offer another alternative to Lacan.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah, I have to think about it. Yeah, well, and you mentioned Laplanche, but Laplanche would be an alternative, of course, in a sense. But Laplanche, with his whole idea on fantasy, of course, also has an approach of infantile sexuality as being intersubjective.
I think Pontalis more so than Laplanche.
Yeah. So my own idea would be a more Foucauldian idea.
I'd probably agree. Okay, good.
Yeah. As an alternative, and certainly also the late Foucault, let's say that plays with this whole cynical tradition of the body, but I mean, and speaking out.
And Foucault does manage to preserve the importance and the force of desire, even though Foucault more returns to, Foucault doesn't return to Freud.
No.
He returns to, if he has to return at all, it's to Saussure and Jakobson.
Yeah.
Well, would you, at this point, do you want to make the comment you made to me privately about the kind of hidden Cartesianism in
Well, I think we were on that track today when we spoke about the difference between the question, what is the body? you posed that question. And Lacan makes this distinction between the biological body and the erogenous body, which is the body invested by meaning, with meaning. So, actually the body as the surface of language. And these are two, and I think that is a very fundamental, let's say, ontological dualism that you find in Lacan, which makes him also, let's say, on this fundamental level, he's not returning to Freud, I would say, exactly in this dualism between the biological body and the erogenous body, which is the surface of meaning of language, or produced by meaning, by language itself, you could say. And what I had told you in the car was that my suspicion is that there's basically a Cartesian model behind this, of making a distinction between the res extensa and the res cogitans, but of course.
That's always the suspicion for any French thinker.
Yeah. But in this case, and I think, but at this point, I think there's a fundamental difference with Freud, and I hope that you recognize this in the way that I talked about Freud, because in Freud you don't find this kind of dualism, because in Freud, let's say, I cannot say it's a monism, but I mean, you see that there is the organic, the biological body, the reaction formations, the organic reaction formations, the first limitations, and cultural systems that are, let's say, basically built on that first fundamental organic structure. So you have another way of conceptualizing the relation between the biological body and mental life.
One more question.
Okay.
You get the last one, like you did earlier
to make
today.
it a good one. Well, thank you very much. I love your presentation. I love it very much. It was very enlightening. Just one small thing about what you just said. I think Lacan returns to Sacher. Well, I suppose.
Sacher.
Sacher and Maslow.
No, different.
Saussure.
Ferdinand de Saussure.
Oh, sorry. We're talking
The
about
structural
progression.
linguistics.
Okay. Well, I'm curious to that as well. So. And the other thing, I was thinking about something that I think you didn't mention. That is the position of the subject. You talk about mourning, as in the Freudian idea, as a consequence or a possible consequence of the loss of a person, but he says in his text that it could be also a consequence of the loss of an ideal, or the land, la patria.
And one son,
His
his own man.
Any land, homeland. And I think he mentioned one or two other things. Also, I was wondering about the position of the subject in relation to Melancholia. I don't know if you've seen the movie of Lars von Trier.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so great, that movie. And the end, the way this I don't. You've seen the movie? Well, for me it was great and a little bit annoying, perhaps. This end, where this lack of lust that I'm talking about presents itself and oblige. Yeah, that's right. The same thing, the position of the subject. I was thinking about other structures that you mentioned, the perversion. And as not, as not something that can be defined by its position, in my opinion, in relation to the law, but perhaps it's an hypothesis, it's a way of thinking this, a position in relation to the desire, once again, of the other, we can say. And now that you mentioned the cat and these two rests that he talks about, I was thinking about a third option. That is
Structures are
this
falling
will be
down.
really the last question. I will try to make it long now. It's not my idea. This third rest that Gabriel Lombardi that you mentioned today invented, or well, I heard this just from him, the rest eligience. So this rest capable of making a choice. That's why this eligience is there. So if it's capable of making a choice within certain limits or certain forzamientos, forcing. We also consider an idea of liberty. We perhaps can talk about this idea of liberty some other time. I think it's also written in actually Lacan. So I will come back to the beginning of my question or comment about the position of the subject, and I think this is one of the huge differences. So I'm not criticizing what you present today. I'm just thinking about something that is left behind in your presentation. That is this, the position of the subject. And I think, I don't know, again, it's an hypothesis, I think perhaps it's something that is left behind, not only in your presentation, perhaps also in some theories, because the difference with Lacan is that he extracts his theory from the clinics, from the difficulties of the clinics. So psychoanalysis, as we were telling this afternoon, or this, sometime today, can't be thought without clinics. And so that's why I say I'm not criticizing what you are saying. I'm not saying something in an opposite direction, or it's just another path that needs to take an account the subject and its position, because it's the field where it works. These clinics, this practice.
Yeah.
We can say without that consideration, it's not consequential.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for your comment. I think that is, you're absolutely right. I mean, both Freud and Lacan are primarily clinicians. Yeah.
Yes.
Of course.
And they
There
say
is no.
explicitly.
I'm not trying to hijack them here for something else, but I think the whole. That was what I was meaning by referring to pathanalysis. I think that Freud already in his early work very clearly saw that what he is describing and learning from his patients cannot be limited to the world of the patients. But, and that is where he starts his whole project of saying, well, what we can use the model of hysteria to describe sexuality of all human beings. And this is the moment where we can make the step to an applied psychoanalysis in terms of we can use the models that we find, the theories that we find in clinical practice, applied on certain cultural phenomena, specific cultural phenomena, by the way, very specific cultural phenomena. So yes, it is based in clinics, but already in the earliest Freud, it propels itself outside of the realm of the clinical practice itself, and becomes what you could call a philosophical anthropology.
Well, I will have to disagree, but it's my point of view. And Freud criticized explicitly the idea of psychoanalysis as a cosmovision, the vision of the world, not the whole world, because there are no vision of the whole world, but these specific particular things of the world. But well, it's my position in relation to my practice as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I can only talk as psychoanalyst.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But by propelling itself out of the realm of clinical practice does not mean that it should not always return to clinical practice to let's say, to test itself.
Yes.
The clinical basis is always there. That is, I'm not going to argue on that. But I think the whole idea of Freud, that it is more than only describing certain aberrations or pathological identities that are different from other identities, that is actually the Freudian revolution in itself. To say, no, we are not dealing here with abnormal identities that are completely constituted in a completely different way than normal people. No, they're actually quite familiar to us. It's only in an exaggerated form that they show us who we are. That's the interesting thing of Freud's approach. And you find similar things in Lacan, when Lacan is talking about sadism. He's not talking about the sadist as an identity different from other persons. He is showing us something about a certain form of desire that we find in every human being. But you have the same procedures. Okay, so.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for your participation this week. It's been fantastic. I need to say something just on behalf of the University of Denver, that this event is made possible by a grant in part from the Marshall Visiting Scholars Fund. So here,
And I have to say something else too. Tomorrow we continue this discussion, and perhaps we can actually pick up this fruitful disagreement. I would love to close the entire conference tomorrow night. So, last but not least, we will meet tomorrow at 1638 Pennsylvania Street at 10. Thank you. 10.
No,
It's 10. Thank you.
That's what it's listed as. Yeah.
10 a.m. We will start again with the one thing we can never be detached from, and it's our clinical practice. So Dominique Canoff will be presenting a case of addiction. Matthias will follow with a case of phobia that will also speak of contemporary clinical work, in as much as there is a screen in the middle. We will speak of the impossible, and we'll see if this is, we can pick it up there, I think. We can pick it up there. Yes, it's a dare. We'll do this. All right.
Thank you.
Until tomorrow.